It always starts the same way. She looks at you not as you are, but as who she imagines you might become. You feel it in her eyes, don't you? That flicker of curiosity, almost like hope. But there's something else underneath it. Something older, deeper, even a little dangerous. It's not really you she sees. It's a silhouette, a projection, a role waiting to be filled. And in the beginning it feels good. It feels like being chosen, like being noticed in a way you haven't been in a long time. But stay there long enough and something begins to shift. The more you try to hold onto that gaze, the more you feel it slipping through your fingers. The more you show up, the more she pulls away. You think, what changed? You think, was I too much? Not enough? And the confusion starts to eat at you quietly beneath your surface, until eventually the ache turns inward and you begin questioning your worth. Carl Jung would say this dynamic is not just emotional, it's archetypal. It's not personal, it's psychic, and unless you learn to see it for what it really is, you will keep repeating it over and over again, with different faces, different names, but the same silent, painful ending. You see, attraction is not just chemistry, it's a collision of shadows, of unconscious desires, of invisible images that live inside you and her. Jung called them the anima and the animus, the inner woman in every man, and the inner man in every woman. These archetypes are not people, they're psychological blueprints, and when you fall into someone's eyes without understanding what lives beneath your own, you end up mistaking projection. She isn't falling for you, not really. She's falling for the part of herself she hasn't yet owned. She's drawn to the mystery in you, not because she sees you clearly, but because something in you reminds her of what she's missing. And if you don't know who you are, you'll start trying to be the version of you she imagines. And that's where it all begins to unravel. Because the anima, the feminine archetype in your unconscious, is hungry for wholeness. And the animus, the masculine archetype in hers, is rarely satisfied. When either of you lacks inner integration, that hunger gets projected outward. You become the object, the savior, the scapegoat, the fantasy, until you can't hold the weight of her unmet longing anymore, and when the image cracks, she withdraws, not because you failed, but because the fantasy failed, and you never even saw it coming. But let's talk about you now. Let's talk about the part of you that gave too much, that said yes too quickly, that felt the sting of her silence and tried to fill it with effort, with kindness, with more access to yourself. The part of you that thought, if I just stay calm, if I just stay available, she'll come back. She won't, at least not for that version of you, because the truth is, availability without self-possession reads as desperation, even when you don't mean it that way. And here's the uncomfortable part. The more emotionally accessible you become without rootedness, the more repelling it is to someone seeking polarity. Not because kindness is unattractive, but because energy without a center creates instability. And no one wants to orbit a man who doesn't have his own gravity. You've been told your whole life that being good, being nice, being emotionally generous is the way to a woman's heart. But what if that story was wrong? What if it was written by people who never understood the unconscious? What if the real key to attraction has nothing to do with how much you give, but how little you need? Don't misunderstand, this isn't about playing hard to get. It's not about withholding affection or pretending not to care. That's just performance. And performance is always a mask for insecurity. What I'm talking about is something much deeper. Something Jung called individuation. A man who has individuated is not emotionally detached to win. He is emotionally sovereign because he's already full, and that fullness, unapologetic, unshakable, is magnetic in a way you cannot fake. She doesn't consciously test you, but her unconscious will. Her energy will push against your boundaries, not to break them, but to feel them, to find out if you're real, if there's something solid behind your words, if your no actually means no, if your yes comes from desire, not fear. She doesn't want to dominate you, she wants to feel safe in your self-containment. And if you give too easily, too often, without center, she feels the instability even if she can't name it. Stillness is not absence. It's presence without the need to prove. It's the animus integrated. When a man can sit in his energy without chasing, without explaining, without trying to fix, something ancient wakes up in her. Not a desire to control you, but a longing to respect you. Because what's rare is not emotional availability. What's rare is emotional grounding, and that is what she's starving for, especially if she hasn't met it in herself yet. So what happens when you say no? What happens when you don't explain yourself? When you stop reacting, stop performing, and let the silence stretch between you without apology? She feels it. Not the absence, the strength, the refusal to abandon yourself for her approval. That's not rejection, that's reverence for yourself. And in that reverence, something primal stirs, because now you are no longer chasing, you are choosing. You are no longer waiting to be seen, you are watching to see if she's worth your presence. And the dynamic flips. Now you're not the boy hoping to be loved, you're the man already whole, the one who can leave, the one who doesn't need to, the one who knows being chosen means nothing if you haven't chosen yourself first. There's a kind of silence that isn't empty. It's filled with presence, with boundaries, with a depth most people aren't used to standing next to. And when you begin to embody that, people notice, especially women. Not because you've become more aloof, but because your energy stops leaking. You're no longer spilling yourself into every interaction hoping to be seen. You're holding yourself, rooted, still, not as a tactic, but as a truth. That's the difference. Emotional detachment is not avoidance. It's the absence of need. You don't need her approval to feel secure. You don't need her affection to feel wanted. You don't need her attention to feel alive. And when you reach that place, your energy becomes powerful without trying, because now you've moved from performance to presence. But let's make something very clear. This is not about being cold. It's not about shutting down or withdrawing love to manipulate. That's not power, that's control. And control is always a reaction to fear. The man who manipulates is no different from the man who begs. Both are still trying to extract something to feel whole. What we're talking about here is very different. This is about becoming magnetic by embodying a stillness that comes from within, a psychological gravity that draws others in, not because you're trying to, but because you've stopped trying. You've become the man who can say no with kindness, who can walk away without anger, who can stay silent not to punish, but because he doesn't need to fill the air just to be seen. That's the paradox. The less you need to prove, the more she begins to wonder. The less you explain, the more she begins to reflect. The less you react, the more she starts to feel. Because now, she's not just dealing with a man, she's dealing with her own projection, unraveling in the face of your unmovable truth. Carl Jung warned us about the danger of being unconscious, about what happens when we let our relationships be guided by the shadows we've refused to integrate, and nowhere is this more obvious than in the dynamics of romantic attraction. The anima and animus don't just influence who we're drawn to. They shape how we act, how we expect the other to behave, and what we subconsciously test for. You've seen this, you've felt it. That moment when you're doing everything right, and it still doesn't land. You're thoughtful, attentive, consistent, and yet her interest begins to fade. You start to question yourself. Am I too boring? Too predictable? But what's really happening is this. The more you orient yourself around her emotional climate, the more you lose the center of your own. That's the key, the center, your groundedness, and not the fake kind, not the one you mimic after watching a video or reading a book, the real one, the one that comes from doing the hard work, from confronting your own wounds, from integrating your own anima. Because until you meet the feminine within, you will keep trying to find her outside. And every time she pulls away, it will feel like you're losing something essential. But you're not. You're being invited, forced even, to return to yourself. And here's where things get interesting. When a man integrates his own inner feminine, his emotions, his sensitivity, his creativity, his vulnerability, he stops seeking women to complete him. He doesn't need to be mothered. He doesn't need to be validated. He doesn't need to be rescued from his loneliness. And because of that, he becomes terrifyingly attractive. Not in a manipulative sense, in a primal one, because now you are no longer projecting your inner split onto her. You are whole, and that wholeness radiates. She feels it, even if she can't explain it. And often her first reaction isn't attraction, it's tension. Because when a man no longer plays the unconscious role, when he no longer dances to the tune of her animus fantasy, he disrupts the pattern, he becomes unfamiliar, he becomes unpredictable, and unpredictability is the birthplace of fascination. So she tests, not consciously, but energetically. She pokes, she pulls, she retreats then returns, not to play games, but to see if your center is real, to see if you will collapse back into the version of you that begged for attention, or if you will remain. And when you do, something powerful shifts. You stop being the man who wants something from her, you become the man she wants something from, not because you've made yourself scarce, but because you've become sovereign. And sovereignty is irresistible. This is where rejection takes on a new meaning. It's no longer a wound, it's a filter, a form of self-honoring. Saying no is no longer about creating distance, it's about maintaining integrity. You're not pushing her away, you're choosing not to abandon yourself. And in that refusal, you transmit something far more powerful than words ever could, self-worth. That's what women respond to on a deep unconscious level, not charm, not effort, not even emotional availability. They respond to the man who is not defined by their response, who doesn't chase approval, who doesn't perform for validation, who simply is. But to become that man, you have to die, not literally, psychologically. You have to let the pleaser die, the one who thought love was something to earn, the one who mistook attention for intimacy, the one who believed that being endlessly available would finally make someone stay. That man has to go, and in his place something new must be born, not a colder version, a deeper one. A man who has walked through the fire of his own projections and come out cleaner, clearer, more whole. A man who doesn't fear rejection because he no longer confuses it with abandonment. A man who knows that the only love worth receiving is the kind that doesn't require him to shrink. This isn't about superiority, it's about sovereignty, emotional sovereignty, psychological sovereignty, the kind of presence that doesn't need noise to be felt, the kind of power that doesn't seek to dominate but refuses to be diminished. And from that place, you become undeniable. Not because you've followed some script, but because you've rewritten your own. You've stopped auditioning for roles in someone else's story. You've become the author of your own. That's individuation. That's the journey Jung was pointing to all along. Individuation is not a concept, it's a path. And it's not gentle. It breaks you. It strips away every identity you borrow just to be loved. It makes you stare into the hollow of your own need and realize how many times you confused connection with survival. How many times you adjusted your truth to keep someone close. But what happens when you stop doing that? When you stop trying to be understood and start trying to be whole? Here's what happens. You begin to recognize the difference between being wanted and being used, between being admired and being projected upon. And, more importantly, you begin to see how much of your pain came not from rejection, but from self-abandonment. Every time you said yes when your body screamed no. Every time you stayed when your soul was already halfway out the door. Every time you explained yourself, hoping it would make someone stay. That wasn't love. That was bargaining. And bargaining is the death of magnetism. Because true attraction doesn't come from effort. It comes from essence, from presence, from the quiet authority of a man who no longer performs. That man isn't hard. He's deep. He isn't arrogant. He's centered. He doesn't withdraw to punish. He simply doesn't chase what costs him his center. Women don't fall for that man because he's emotionally distant. They're drawn to him because he's emotionally sovereign. Because standing next to him feels like standing next to a mirror, one that reflects their own disintegration or their own depth, depending on where they are in their journey. That's why some women fear him, not because he's dangerous, but because he doesn't collapse. He doesn't flinch when they test him. He doesn't need to be needed, and that forces them to confront the very parts of themselves they've avoided: neediness, control, unresolved projections. He doesn't trigger their abandonment wound by leaving, he triggers it by not attaching. And yet for the woman who's done her inner work, for the woman who's begun integrating her own animus, that man is a revelation. He doesn't feel threatening, he feels safe. Not in the way the nice guy felt safe because he had no edge, but in the way a grounded presence does. He doesn't offer emotional chaos, he offers spaciousness. He doesn't ask her to shrink, he makes room for her expansion. This is the kind of man who doesn't just attract, he evokes. And not every woman is ready for that. Some will project, some will rage, some will try to provoke you back into the familiar pattern. Because mystery is uncomfortable, and when you don't show all your cards, the insecure mind calls you emotionally unavailable. But you're not unavailable. You're unshakable, and that is something rare. You're not walking around trying to be aloof. You're just no longer leaking energy. You're not playing hard to get. You've just stopped proving your worth. You're not rejecting her. You've just stopped rejecting yourself. This is the deepest shift of all, when you stop needing to be chosen because you've already chosen you. Not as a performance, not as a tactic, but as a return. A return to the man you were before the conditioning, before the shame, before the heartbreak that made you doubt your own presence. A return to your essence. Untamed, unapologetic, and whole. It's at this point that attraction becomes inevitable, not because you're doing something, but because you've become someone. The kind of someone who no longer fractures under the pressure to please, the kind who doesn't define his masculinity through conquest or compliance, but through calm, through clarity, through knowing when to engage and when to let go. You don't ghost, you release. You don't withhold, you protect. You don't suppress your emotions, you express them when it matters. And you don't over-explain your boundaries. You embody them quietly, consistently. And because of that, everything changes. The woman who was used to testing men to feel safe suddenly feels something deeper, reverence, not because you demanded it, but because you no longer betrayed yourself to earn her affection. The pattern breaks, the energy shifts, and now you're not just someone she desires, you're someone she respects. But even then, your center doesn't move. Whether she comes closer or pulls away, you remain, rooted, because now you know her reaction is not your mirror, her confusion is not your crisis, her distance is not your deficiency. You've become magnetic not through absence, but through presence, not through games, but through gravity, not through being hard to get, but through being hard to shake. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of individuation as the integration of the self. It's the process of reclaiming every part of you that you once disowned to be loved. It's the death of the persona, the social mask you wore just to belong, and the birth of the authentic. The man who no longer asks, "Will she choose me?" but instead asks, "Does this reflect who I've become?" That's a man who knows his power, not because he dominates others, but because he doesn't need to. His power lies in restraint, in discernment, in the sacredness of no, and in the rarity of his yes. Most won't understand him. Some will mock him. Others will call him cold. But a few, those who have met their own shadow, will see him for what he is: a mirror, a catalyst, a quiet revolution against the emotional slavery most have mistaken for love. And for those few, he becomes unforgettable, not because he filled a fantasy, but because he didn't. Because he stood there, sovereign when everyone else begged. Because he said no when the world begged him to perform. Because he chose depth over attention and clarity over connection. Because he remembered who he was and stopped trying to be anything else. You see, there's a kind of love that doesn't ask for performance. It doesn't demand access to every corner of you. It doesn't chase, it doesn't cling, and it doesn't collapse at the first sign of distance. But most people never get to experience it because they've never become the version of themselves that can receive it. You can't attract what you haven't integrated. That's the truth Jung kept pointing us toward. Until you meet the parts of yourself you've been avoiding, you'll keep reaching for relationships that reflect your fragmentation. You'll call it chemistry, you'll call it passion, but what you're really feeling is the pull of familiar trauma patterns masquerading as love. The only way out is in. You don't become magnetic by becoming more likable. You become magnetic by becoming more whole. When a man stops trying to be chosen and starts integrating the pieces of himself he spent years disowning, his rage, his grief, his need for approval, his shame, he stops orbiting around external validation. He becomes the axis of his own life. From that place, his energy changes. It stops seeking, it starts radiating, and that radiation draws in something different. Not just attention, but resonance. Not just attraction, but alignment. And this is where things begin to feel surreal. Because when you stop needing her to see you, she finally can. When you stop contorting yourself to stay in her life, she begins to question her own position in yours. When you stop pursuing, not out of pride but from peace, you activate something dormant in her, an ache, a curiosity, a mirror. You become a reflection of everything she's both drawn to and terrified of. A man she can't control, can't predict, and can't pin down with tactics. A man who doesn't rise and fall based on her emotional weather. A man who doesn't beg to be understood because he's already made peace with being misunderstood. That's what breaks the pattern. Not silence born from fear, but silence born from fullness. Not withdrawal to manipulate, but presence that doesn't require proximity to exist. She may pull away, she may come closer. She may test, push, challenge. But none of that dictates your truth. You're no longer reacting, you're responding from a place of deep knowing, from a place that says, I don't need you to like me. I need to stay honest with myself. This isn't indifference, it's maturity. It's the point where the animus becomes integrated, where the masculine no longer serves as a persona, but as a principle, a grounded structure that doesn't waver based on emotional tides, a stillness that holds space, not because it wants something, but because it can. And that stillness, it's rare. So rare, it becomes almost holy. Most people are addicted to reactivity, to chaos, to stimulation, but stillness? It confronts them. It forces them to feel their own noise, their own disconnection, their own projections, and if they haven't done their own inner work, they'll try to make you responsible for it. That's why this path isn't for everyone. When you stop engaging in the game, the players get angry. They'll accuse you of being cold, distant, arrogant, emotionally unavailable. But what they're really saying is, I can't reach you with the tools that used to work. I can't pull you out of yourself. I can't provoke you into losing your center. And no, they don't always mean it maliciously. They just don't know how to stand in the presence of a man who no longer needs them. And yet, for the woman who's done her work, that's exactly what makes you unforgettable. You don't offer her a pedestal, you offer her a mirror. You don't worship her, you witness her. You don't chase her emotions, you hold your own. And in that holding she feels something she can't get from anyone else. Truth. Not the truth of flattery or performance or pleasing. The truth of a man who sees her but doesn't abandon himself to do it. That's the real power. Not dominance, not seduction, integrity. Because when you're no longer swayed by every storm, she begins to trust the shelter of your presence. When you're no longer seeking approval, she begins to feel safe enough to soften. When you're no longer reacting from wound, she stops reacting from fear. You break the cycle not by fixing her, but by facing yourself. And when you do, the dynamic becomes sacred. Now, it's not a game, it's an invitation. To depth, to devotion, to dual individuation. Because the woman who truly wants to meet you at your center must first meet her own. She must confront her projections, her patterns, her inner masculine, and when she does, she no longer wants a puppet, she wants a partner. So the question becomes, are you willing to be that? Are you willing to stand in your presence without needing to be rescued, rewarded, or recognized? Are you willing to say no, not to punish, but to protect your own wholeness? Are you willing to walk away not because you're cold, but because your soul refuses to stay somewhere that costs you your center? Because if you are, you don't need a script. You don't need lines, you don't need techniques. You've already become the answer to the question she didn't know she was asking. Man who exists outside of her emotional economy. Man who knows his worth without her applause. A man who stands still and still commands the room. This isn't about being untouchable. It's about being unshakable. Because you've finally remembered, the one who can walk away never has to. Now here's the part no one talks about. Becoming this man, this grounded, self-contained presence can be incredibly lonely at first, because once you stop chasing validation, most of your relationships begin to reveal their true nature. You start seeing how much of your life was built around the silent expectation that you'd perform, that you'd give, explain, apologize, adjust. When you stop doing that, people leave, not because you've done something wrong, but because they were never really with you. They were with the version of you that never made them question themselves. And when that version dies, so does the illusion. This is the part of the journey where most men turn back, where they soften their no, reopen the door, re-engage in the performance, not because they want to, but because they can't bear the silence that follows individuation. But if you can endure that silence, if you can stay in that space long enough, something begins to shift. First, within you, then around you. You begin to feel less alone, not because more people show up, but because you start showing up for yourself. You stop betraying your inner voice to keep the peace. You stop looking outside for reflections of your worth. You stop seeking the thrill of approval and start finding peace in presence. You realize your magnetism isn't something you create, it's something you uncover. It was always there, hidden beneath the layers of shame, fear, and conditioning. And once you touch it, once you feel what it means to be a man who lives in full alignment, you can't go back. Not to chasing, not to begging, not to adjusting your tone just to sound more acceptable. You can't go back to the games, to the emotional acrobatics, to shrinking, just to be chosen. You start speaking less, but everything you say lands harder. You start moving slower, but everything you do carries more weight. You stop trying to be liked and start being deeply respected. Not by everyone, but by those who matter. Especially by women who have walked their own path, women who have integrated their anima and animus, women who are no longer looking for a man to save them, but to stand beside them, women who don't need you to be perfect, but who are drawn to your integrity, your self-respect, your emotional sovereignty. And that's where the deeper connection begins. No more tests, no more power struggles, no more unspoken contracts built on insecurity. Just presence, depth, honesty. This is what Jung meant when he said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Because once you do, Once you stop trying to be who you think she wants and start living as who you actually are, you become the rarest thing in the world. A man who is whole. A man who doesn't need love to feel worthy, but who receives it with open hands when it's offered in truth. A man who doesn't chase pleasure to escape himself, but who brings pleasure wherever he goes because of the way he carries his being. A man who walks into a room and doesn't demand attention, but shifts the energy with his silence. Because that silence isn't empty. It's filled with everything he no longer gives away. That's what people feel when you're no longer leaking your energy to be liked. That's what she feels when she's in your presence and her nervous system finally exhales. Not because you're a performer, because you're a pillar. You don't rush, you don't retreat, you don't react. You hold, you remain, you listen to yourself before you respond to her. You choose your peace over her comfort. You hold your line, not to dominate but to protect what's sacred within you. And when she leans in, when she mirrors your depth, when she reveals her own sovereignty, then and only then do you offer your full presence. Because now, you're not choosing out of lack. You're choosing out of alignment. Now it's not about being needed. It's about being met. This is the evolution Jung envisioned. Not a man detached from the feminine, but a man who has integrated it within himself. Not a man afraid of emotion, but one who channels it with discipline. Not a man who flees from conflict, but one who stands inside it with clarity and grace. You become that man not through tricks, not through tactics, not through trying to manipulate attraction. You become him through the painful, liberating, holy process of no longer needing to be anyone else. And as you do, the feminine shifts around you. She sees you differently, not because she finally figured out your value, but because you finally embodied it without needing her to. You've reclaimed your mystery. Not because you're hiding, but because you've become too full to explain. And from that place, the one who can walk away never has to, because he's already home.